Welcome back to the Atlantic Council's programming on the sidelines of the IMF World Bank spring meetings. I'm here in IMF HQ2, where we're going to talk about trade and security, and I'm joined by some of the most perfect guests. If you're not already following their work, you're missing out, and I think you will after this event. So first we have Peter Harrell, a non-resident fellow with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and then I'm also joined by Emily Kilcrease, who is a Senior Fellow and Director with the Energy, Economics, and Security Program at the Center for New American Security. So Peter, Emily, we have a pretty short amount of time to talk about everything that has happened with trade policy in the last couple of weeks, couple of months, take your pick. So I just want to start off with objectives. There's been a range of policies that have been citing also a range of objectives, from stopping illicit fentanyl imports to balancing trade deficits. So I want to turn to you, Emily, first. Can you identify a leading objective that is guiding the Trump administration's policies right now?
Yeah, thanks, Sophia. And it feels like it's been years in the trade space over the last couple of weeks. But look, it is important to start with this question of what is the Trump administration trying to achieve with its tariff policies? And there has been confusion because they have multiple objectives. So they're clearly trying to use some of these emergency power-based tariffs to just get other countries to do things quickly on security-related issues. I think that's what we saw initially in the Colombia example. That was very short-lived, but I think illustrative. You certainly see it in the Canada and Mexico case, where they're trying to deal with some fentanyl and migration issues. So that's one bucket of their tariff strategy. You also have the revenue-generating strategy, where they're clearly trying to pull in money through tariff revenue. And then you have this question of, well, are we resetting the rules of the global economic order, or doing a hard reset on the global trading system? And that's where the reciprocal tariffs come in. And part of this all as well is they have this vision that by putting up stronger tariffs, they're going to incentivize more investment in the United States as companies try to get around the tariff wall by making those investments domestically. And I think each of those, you could take each of those on their own merits, but I think one of the things that's been difficult as an analyst and an observer is to try to figure out how they'll all work at once and how they may prioritize between some of these different objectives. And I think what we've seen with the 90-day pause on the reciprocal tariff program, the reaction to kind of the bond market freak out, as for lack of a better technical term for that, in response to some of the tariffs, is that they're being pushed much more towards the negotiating strategy. They're trying to use tariffs as leverage to get trading partners to address trade barriers. Now, there's still a lot of work to go on that. I think it's all very much still in flux and there's a high level of uncertainty. But to the extent that there's some emerging prioritization, I think that's where we're going to see things go, just because of all of these external pressures on the president's strategy.
Would you agree? Anything else you'd point out?
No, I broadly agree with Emily. I think Emily gave a very nice laydown of what the overall priorities are. I want to very much agree in particular that at some point they're going to have to make some choices about how to prioritize these, right? I mean, if you just to sort of think about the simplest example, if you want tariffs for revenue, you actually want to set it at a rate that doesn't encourage that investment to get the manufacturing here in the United States, because if it's all here, you're not importing things, you're not collecting the revenue. So I think they're developing a theory of how they can kind of fit these together, and you have kind of this low universal tariff, and then the threat of reciprocal tariffs for negotiation, and then you have these kind of product-specific tariffs on things like cars and steel and aluminum to get that investment here. So I think they're developing a theory of how they fit together. But I very much agree with you. There is this kind of both inherent tension, and at least so far, they've not provided a lot of clarity on how they're fitting it together.
Do you think this will change over time, like over the next 4 years? Do you think that revenue will possibly go lower on that priority list as maybe they're working with countries on trade deals? Do you think they'll be pushed even further to focus on negotiation in deals if markets are continuing to respond unfavorably?
I think so. I mean, I think there's a fairly narrow window at this point where they can still execute on this strategy and come up with these priorities and still be able to claim victory on us. But I think it's a short window, right? Like, I think the markets are highly sensitive now to any sort of turbulence coming out of the White House, and that will act as a meaningful constraint. It already has acted as a meaningful constraint, both on tariffs and some of the comments that the president has made around the Federal Reserve as well. You also, I think, are going to see some impatience eventually about what these vaunted deals are that the White House is striking with trading partners. To foot stomp one point, which I think is important, it's incredibly difficult to negotiate new trade agreements with other major economies. It takes years, and we're saying we're going to do this in 90 days. We're actually not doing that in 90 days. We're going to be coming up with framework agreements with a priority set of countries, and if we can do that, if the U.S. can do that, I actually think that's a good sign. But again, like, they only have, I think, a couple of months to show some real progress on the tariff strategy before they start having more of these economic constraints, potentially political constraints, even from members of their own party that start to come in and push them in one direction or another.
I would add, in addition to the way they are reacting, the administration is reacting to the market sell-off, which is clearly constraining their actions. I think they are beginning to wake up to the fact that tariffs, at least at the levels they're talking about, will flow through to consumer prices, right? And you saw this in the way that they very quickly realized that if they had a 145% tariff on smartphones and laptops imported from China, that was going to flow through very quickly to consumer prices, and so they exempted those products. You see that just recently in the news that they may be giving some broad exemptions to the car part tariffs to help U.S. manufacturing of cars in a way that doesn't mean anyone going out and buying a new car is going to pay another $5,000-$6,000 for that thing. So I think they have a kind of lived memory. I think the administration has a lived memory from their first term trade war, which was just much, much smaller, right? It was maybe 1/10 or maybe 1/8 the size of their current trade war in terms of the economic impact of their tariffs, just vastly smaller. And their view coming out of that was, well, no one really felt the consumer costs from the China trade war, so means there won't be consumer costs here. But what they're realizing is that when you take a China trade war where there probably were price increases, but they weren't things people felt every day, you magnify that by 8 or 10 times, all of a sudden you do have consumer costs that you need to think about. And I think that is beginning to factor into their policy in a way they were hoping they wouldn't have to consider it just a couple of weeks ago.
Right, of course, and we can't really compare to Trump 1, but we also don't really have any other precedent to see how this is exactly going to play out for consumers. But I guess, so you mentioned some of these product-specific tariffs, Peter. So I want to talk a little bit about 232. You know, we have universal tariffs now on steel and aluminum, and there's all of these investigations out on copper, semiconductors. Can you just help explain, Emily, is it the same national security threat to be importing and relying on an import of a product from each country equally? I mean, is each country the same level of national security threat?
I would maybe rephrase that a little bit, because I think if we're trying to channel the administration's thinking on it, it's that they think it's a national security threat to not have the domestic capacity to produce these goods. And I am sympathetic to that for certain of these products. I think we've learned some of those hard supply chain lessons through the pandemic, and as we think about, God forbid, some sort of conflict with China, like, there's a reason why we want some of that capacity here domestically. And I think the question then becomes, well, what are the policy levers that you need to pull to achieve that, particularly if you're talking about just, for example, something like legacy chips, where the U.S. simply does not make any of those. They're highly complex, highly cost sensitive, and so is putting up a tariff wall the right way to get that capacity onshore? Or would we be more successful with some sort of broader mix of tools that also includes mechanisms to secure reliable access from close trading partners, right? And so I think this is ultimately what they're going to have to grapple with, is that a unilateral tariff wall is unlikely to actually meet the objective of getting domestic manufacturing back in these critical sectors. But potentially there's another mix of policy tools that they could use, but they're going to have to be targeted on the most critical goods. They're going to have some level of engagement with other producer nations, simply because we can't get this all back in the United States. And we need to think much more creatively about that mix. And maybe the last point I'll make on this is that one thing that is helpful about the 232s is that it is a more orderly process for arriving at a policy solution. There will be public comment periods. There is more of an investigation period. It's short, in terms of the initial public comment periods for some of these products, but hopefully that helps with some of the very disruptive effects that we've seen from other tariff announcements coming out of the White House.
Certainly, and Peter, I know that you've talked a lot about this process and the fact that for most of these tariffs, the administration is choosing to use IEEPA rather than 232 or 301. Why do you think they're doing that?
Yeah, so let me step back and explain the legal authority a little bit, just I'm not sure if all of our viewers sort of understand the U.S. domestic statutory regime. So if you look at Trump's Term 1 trade war against China, he used a statute called Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, which required him to investigate whether there was an unfair trade practice that China was engaging in that hurt U.S. commerce, and then he could propose tariffs in response, and there was notice and comment period. And then for some of these product-specific tariffs, as Emily was just saying, there's this thing called Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which basically lets the president investigate, or Secretary of Commerce, investigate whether imports of a particular product impair U.S. national security. If they find they do, you can use tariffs or other tools in response. And both of these statutes are quite powerful in a certain way. They give you a lot of power to impose tariffs at an endpoint. But they have a lot of process around them, right? It took on the order of 16 months in the first term between when he started his China investigation when tariffs actually came into force. And then Section 232 typically takes 9 months or so. You can compress it, but typically it would take 6 or 9 months. That's not what Trump's wanted to do this time around, right? What he has wanted to be able to do is to say, in 3 days, enormous tariffs are coming into place, and use that to kind of rattle foreign countries, to kind of force them very quickly to the negotiating table. And I think maybe also to show that he's serious about the tariffs, because I do think if he only did some of these more traditional tools over 6 or 9 month timelines, there'd be some skepticism in U.S. industry about whether these tariffs were real. So I think he's wanted to do this sort of shock and awe strategy. And in order to do that shock and awe strategy, he has relied on a 1977 statute, which we all call in the sort of the national security space, IEEPA, which Congress passed basically to allow presidents to impose sanctions and do other things in responses to national emergencies overseas. So passed in 1977, first used by Jimmy Carter in 1979 after the Iranian Revolution to put sanctions on Iran, used by all presidents since, including President Trump during his first term for sanctions on Venezuela, including by Biden for sanctions on Russia in 2022. Never been used for tariffs before. And we can have a longer discussion about that. There are now 4 lawsuits challenging whether it is lawful to use this statute for tariffs. But what he likes about it is that it doesn't have the process. It gives him this kind of immediacy and scale that lets him take this kind of shock and awe approach to trading partners.
Right, but do you think it's only for the timing? I mean, there have been a range of national security concerns with trade that the Biden administration was working on, and you were working on this with the administration. So, I mean, help us kind of draw the line. What are some of the very serious national security concerns that the administration needs to address with U.S. trade? And maybe what are some of the ways that they're using it that are less addressing those national security concerns?
Well, so I want to differentiate. So what we've seen for these IEEPA tariff executive orders, we've seen the first ones, which was one back in February and March that ended up imposing 20% tariffs on China. And then we saw ones on Canada and Mexico that threatened 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, did impose them, and then basically goods from Canada and Mexico that comply with the 2020 USMCA trade agreement are now exempt. But for other products, they are still in place. Those are purportedly the national emergency relied on. The purported reason for that, as Emily said in her opening remarks, is fentanyl. America has a fentanyl crisis, and Trump sees tariffs on Canada and Mexico as, a way of putting leverage pressure on them to get them to do more things about fentanyl. The emergency he has declared for the universal tariffs and for the reciprocal tariffs, they've said is a systemic trade deficit. Now, the U.S. has had a trade deficit since 1975, every single year. And we're actually not, if you just look at the data of the trade deficit as percent of GDP, we're actually only about half as large a trade deficit as percent of GDP as we were in 2005. Maybe 60%. So actually substantially smaller, still very large, and larger in aggregate dollars, but smaller as a percent of GDP. So I think it's very hard to argue that the trade deficit is a national emergency. That's not to say there aren't real problems. Like, it's a trade problem. It's a problem for American manufacturing. The trade deficit definitely hurts, and our reliance of imports definitely hurts national security interests in terms of undermining manufacturing of certain critical products. So it's not to say that our inability to produce certain things in this country isn't a national security issue. It clearly is. We need to be able to produce defense technology here. We need to be able to produce certain other kinds of products here in the United States for our national security. But the trade deficit is a trade deficit. I don't see that as a national emergency.
Right. So, Emily, back to you. Let's go through this policy tool mix that you talked about earlier. So, if the trade deficit is a concern, especially for specific industries, can you give us some ideas on how else the administration can address that and what can maybe complement these tariffs or maybe would be better choices in some case?
Yeah, I do think it would be helpful to move away from the trade deficit as the sole metric by which we judge our economic relationship with other countries. And I think that's been one of the complications trying to understand how the reciprocal tariff program will unfold is because, as Peter rightly pointed out, there's some issues there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to have balanced trade with every single country around the world or with every single product or service, right? Like, that's just not how our economy needs to work. But if you take the administration's objective of getting some of these critical goods onshored and having that manufacturing capacity, I think you're looking at a much broader suite of both kind of positive incentives as well as some restrictions to try to get at that. So, for example, if you're looking at chips, which is a national security relevant technology that we've been talking about for some time, I think the Biden team did great work trying to catalyze private sector investment in the United States through things like the CHIPS Act. There's a whole conversation we need to have around making sure we have the labor force for that, making sure we have talent pipelines for that, making sure we have a tax structure that supports that. And actually, to give the Trump administration credit, I think they're very laser focused on things like permitting, which is a really difficult process in the United States and is going to, if they're able to fix that and remove some of that red tape, I actually think could have a huge positive benefit for domestic manufacturing. So I think there's a bunch of stuff that we need to do domestically to make this a more attractive environment. But then there's also going to be another piece of it, which is how does the U.S. Manufacturing capacity relate to global markets? And this is if I'm going to fault the Biden administration for something, is that they didn't focus enough on opening global markets. There wasn't that proactive trade policy component to match the domestic industrial policy component. And I think I'm somewhat encouraged to hear some of the statements out of, for example, USTR, where they clearly have market opening as one of their goals. And so if you can get to the right balance of doing everything we need to do domestically to make it an attractive investment environment, getting those open markets, so if we have a productive manufacturing base, we can sell outside of the United States in addition to our very important domestic consumption market. And then you need to think about the inputs question. If we're going to manufacture here, how do we make it as cost effective to manufacture in the United States? And that probably means taking a much deeper look at the supply chains needed for that domestic manufacturing, including how tariffs will impact that goal.
Certainly. But I have to say, so there has been all of this effort to rattle trade partners and open markets. And, let's say that's successful. that's still like a lot for businesses to be dealing with in the short term, especially for small businesses that maybe struggle to manage their supply chains, don't really have as good a visibility. I guess, Peter, what would you say to those businesses, and do you think there's a better way for the administration to kind of help them through this?
So I do think that the chaos that we have seen over the last couple of months, where tariffs come on very quickly within a couple of days, maybe get partially rolled back, maybe get partially put back on. The chaotic nature is really extremely hard for businesses to deal with. And it also fundamentally is counterproductive to the Trump administration's own goals of attracting investment. Because if you are looking to manufacture things here in the United States, and you don't know what your input costs are going to be, are you going to pay a 10% tariff, 25% tariff, are you getting an exemption? You don't know what your input costs are going to be. You don't know what the retaliation of foreign governments is going to be. Like if you're making something here that you want to sell abroad, are you going to be able to, or are they going to be retaliated? The chaos and uncertainty has, I think, just been entirely counterproductive to the administration's goals. In a way that a more orderly but still aggressive trade process, I think, would be much more useful. Something that sent clear kind of signals. We are going to be imposing tariffs on kind of the following products because we want manufacturing here, and there's kind of an orderly rate. Something that sent very clearly a signal: if you're going to manufacture things here, like if you're going to manufacture semiconductors here, we're going to give you exemptions on the equipment, which is mostly made outside the United States, to manufacture that here, right? Because if you're going to build a $3 billion fab here in the U.S., probably $1.8 billion of that is equipment. If you got to pay 10, 20, 25%, like you're just jacking up the price of the fab, right? So they got to come up with a way of thinking through the inputs. They got to make it more orderly. They got to figure out how to actually close some deals, whether they're just sort of paper term sheet deals for now or turning into comprehensive deals. They got to figure out how to close some deals to make sure there isn't massive retaliation. And both probably, frankly, somewhat reduce the scope of their ambition, and then also definitely bring a lot more order to it. But for your question of small business, I mean, write your congressman or call your congressman, tell the administration, bring some more order to this process, highlight why it's so challenging for you as a small business who, can't have your CEO go sit in the Oval Office to figure out how to navigate this process. I think you got to engage politically, frankly, at this point. And urge some more order be brought to all of this.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think one other kind of incentive structure that I could see benefiting U.S. manufacturers is this idea of not having U.S. content in goods that we're importing be subject to these tariffs. But, I mean, do either of you know how that's going to be enforced or calculated? I'll go to anyone who can answer.
No, I mean, I think it's just a good point about how difficult compliance is going to be across the board. If they're really successful in doing this hard reset on how the global trading system works and introducing new things like 20% U.S. content won't be that's really difficult to implement. And just to reemphasize Peter's point, we actually need to boil the frog a little bit more here. You need to leave time for not just the private sector to figure out how to implement this, but for the government to figure out how to implement this. As customs or the External Revenue Service or whatever entity is going to be collecting this tariff revenue is, how do they actually implement this? And when they see a good come across the border, how do they know what the tariff rate is? I actually think there's an enormous amount of compliance work that still needs to be sorted out. So I don't know what the answer is now, but I think that's one of the practical implementation challenges they're going to have to grapple with.
And do you think they'll have to figure that out before the 90-day pause is over? Do you think it'll take longer than that?
Well, we've seen out of the public reporting around some of Secretary Bessent's comments over the last 48, 72 hours that they may, if negotiations are going well, and also if they fear further stock market plunges, they may, kick the can down the road and allow some more time for these negotiations. So I think that kind of timing remains a little bit TBD as this plays out. I do think, to echo Emily, if we're going to make really complicated changes to trading rules. So those are going to take time for the corporate sector to figure out. So, your embedded content question. So if you make a semiconductor here and you send it to Malaysia and the semiconductor is, embedded on a printed circuit, probably 60 to 70% of the value of that printed circuit is the underlying chip, right? That's just the way, it's not a lot of value on the simple circuits it's embedded in. So then that is imported back into the United States. Under current law, you would pay, and that circuit's worth $100, you'd pay tariffs on $100. There is some talk you could move that so you'd only pay tariffs on, say, $30, right? Because the $70 of that 100 is the chip that's U.S. made, and so the tariff would be on the $30 that is added in Malaysia. But for companies to track the value, like what is the U.S. content value, because I then have to notify as a company, CBP, like I'm only paying tariffs on the 30% of the value. Like, it's just enormously complicated. And it is going to take, I don't know, probably at least a year, for most companies to really work up the modalities of how they'd track that value in order to be able to pay tariffs on it.
Do you think there's enough incentive now, just with how aggressive the Trump administration has been with its tariffs, for companies to think really long term about how they're reshoring or restructuring their supply chains? Or do you think it's been so back and forth that companies might be waiting it out?
I think it's both, honestly.
Okay.
I mean, I think because of the uncertainty, when I've talked to private sector friends, they've basically said that there's just a pause on future business decisions until there's more clarity. And to be clear, I don't think we get to the end of the 90-day pause and all of a sudden everything is clear. Like, I think we are in for a prolonged period of uncertainty. And maybe we'll get little drips and drabs along the way, but it's going to be a longer period of time. But I can also say that all these companies are consumed with this issue right now. They are trying to figure out what the ultimate end state is. And it's important to remember that even though we've been talking about the on again, off again nature, and there was the 90-day pause on the reciprocal tariff program, we still have a lot of tariffs that are in place. There is still the 10% baseline tariff that is there. There's the sector-specific stuff that has been imposed and that is coming. There's still the North America and China tariffs. There's still a very much higher baseline of tariffs that companies are going to have to grapple with. So I don't think there's any scenario in which this all just goes away, right? So they're going to have to figure out between like the low end and the high end of how those tariff scenarios play out. What does that mean for their investment decisions? What does that mean for their supply chain structures? And hopefully that's part of their engagement with the administration as well, is like, we can do it this way, but it's going to be hard to do it that way, for example, to help provide some of that clarity and predictability to whatever the end game is here.
Just to add one quick point, and we're coming to the end of our time, to the uncertainty. Because there is also another layer of uncertainty, which is the one scenario where maybe much of this goes away, which is the court cases prevail, right? I mentioned earlier the 4 court cases against the universal reciprocal tariffs and the Canada, Mexico, and China tariffs, not against the product-specific tariffs. They're beginning to wind their way through the courts. This has never been done before. Tariffs have never been imposed under the statute before. I think you have to take seriously, there's a chance at some point in the next couple of months all of this stuff goes away because of judicial decisions. That'll then force the administration to come up with some other legal theories for their tariffs, which they might do, but that would probably take them 6 months, 12 months or so to come up with. And I do want to press on the legal point. I know we're not a legal show here, but I want you to think about what they are asserting is that an emergency power passed in 1977 lets them upend and reorder the global trading order, where you've had FTAs, or you had a U.S. congressional decision to join the WTO just by fiat. That seems hard for me to stomach. But there's another implication that businesses need to think about here. Because the legal argument the Trump administration is making is that the word regulate in this statute means they can impose taxes. And if you're a business, say you're a bank, do you really want to think that the word regulate in the Securities Act of 1934, which sets up the SEC to regulate stock trading, can the SEC now impose a tax on you? If you're a trucking company and the Department of Transportation has the authority to regulate interstate trucking, can they now impose a tax on you? Because that's the argument the government's making, that anywhere they have a power to regulate, they can now tax. And I just don't think the courts are going to hold for that.
Well, we'll see. That's plenty to watch out for. But I guess we are getting close to time now. So I just want to thank you both for joining for this conversation. I hope it was helpful to our audience. And to our audience, Thank you for tuning in and stay watching. So the next event will be lessons on emerging market payments models with Alicia Changani and Polina Kempinski. So stay tuned for that, and thanks for watching.